Yeah, okay. I did that. Rookie mistake.
Typical rookie mistake.
Rookie mistake, Millhouse.
Damn it! Rookie mistake!
Really just rookie mistakes.
So, another rookie mistake.
Take initiative.
Rookie mistake.
Made some very rookie mistakes. I was not focused.
You rookie mistake.
Love to get the wall.
All right, you ready to go?
Yes.
Great. Hello. Hello. And welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I am here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, future Magic Con panelist Maddox.
That's right. We're going to be conning people at the Magic Convention, right?
Not conning them. No, that's not how it works.
We're going to be doing a panel at Magic Con. What is it actually called? Magic Con
It's just
Philly?
called Magic Con.
Great.
I'm pretty sure. But it takes place in Philadelphia next month, about 4 weeks from the publishing of this podcast. I had to make it your nickname so I remembered to mention it, because it's been on my list to mention for the last couple weeks, but then I always forget to. So if you are going to be at Magic Con Philly or Magic Con or whatever it's called, Anthony and I will be there. We'll be hanging around. Parker will be there too. And we will be doing a panel with Parker, with Justin Parnell, and with Gwen Decker, all about, guess what? Cube. And that's all I'll say for now. So if you are a fan of ours and a fan of Cube, show up in the audience so that we can have somebody on our team out there, you know?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think we have, obviously a lot of great people there. It's going to be a fun panel, and plus we'll be around the whole time. I don't know that we're going to be playing at any events or anything other than just having cubes with us, probably having stuff with us.
Yeah, I mean, compared to CubeCon, I'm actually kind of excited to have no actual thing to do.
That's fair.
Like no scheduled anything, but just walking around with some starter decks, with some battle boxes, do some cube drafts. That's my plan.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to it.
I also plan to raid the vendors for my latest cube project. We haven't talked about the neoclassical cube on the podcast. That's weird. Like, I feel like I'm not keeping it a secret. You can go look at it. It's on my Cube Cobra. It's not quite done yet. It's a new cube I've been working on. For that cube, I am trying to collect a bunch of beat-up versions of cards because I intend to play it unsleeved, as is the fashion of the time, thanks to Ristic Studies' Dear Gonti Love Sophie video. So because of that, I have a bunch of cards I'm trying to get damaged versions of, and I feel like vendors often bring more damaged cards to events because people don't want to buy damaged cards online because you don't really know what you're
getting.
You
want to kind of get your hands on it and see
but
what
if you're in
like.
person, you're maybe more willing to buy a damaged card. I remember past events I've been to, we used to go to GP DC every year. I remember there'd always be a couple vendors with like just big cases full of expensive damaged cards. That's what I'm looking for. If you're going to be at Magic Con Philly and you happen to have any of the damaged cards I need for that cube, let me know. Let's make a deal. I'm here to trade. I'm here to buy. I'm trying to fill that cube out.
So I feel like you always shout out something about me from the week, but I feel like we got to give you the shout out that you gave me last week.
What I do?
You've just been crushing it in Cube the last week.
Well, I feel like I was actually going to bring this up.
Okay, good. I'm glad that you were going to bring up that you were also doing very well.
Last night you were like, oh, you're doing so well at my cubes. And I thought you referenced 3 drafts, but it's only 2 drafts, right?
Maybe it was only 2.
In my memory, it was like, 3 drafts. But then so you may have snuck a peek at the spreadsheet I had up on my computer screen.
A new spreadsheet has appeared.
I listened to the stats episode of the Guardian Project podcast, or the first of 3 that they're doing this year. And I always look forward to that episode. It's always interesting to hear the perspective of their very small sample size anecdotal stats, which obviously you can't do like data analysis on, but I feel like you can learn something from that. They're talking about Commander games. I thought, it's only January. I can remember all the games I've played so far this year. Let me just, for this entire year, track every match of Cube that I play.
I see. Okay, that's cool.
So that's what I'm doing over here in this little spreadsheet. And I made it, and then I was like, I think I've only played 5 games of your Cube, 5 matches of your Cube in the past week. But I thought there was more, too.
It's hard to remember. It all kind of blurs together.
What matters is not that much of a streak. It's actually just 5 matches. It's not
that's
so much.
That's fine, though. You did great. I mean, I feel like I had a week of winning, barely. And you just had like the last couple drafts have completely smashed it in the Turbo Cube and the regular Cube on stream.
Yeah, I'm not going to put one of those spoiler alerts in again because I got a lot of feedback that people did not like that, and I should not continue to do that. So I will say now ahead of time.
Spoiler skip ahead
alert.
15 seconds.
That's what I did say after a bunch of alarm sounds. You didn't listen to it. I put a bunch of like air horn sirens and stuff in there. I made sure the volume was appropriate, but I think it's still very jarring for somebody to hear an air raid siren basically when they're in the middle of their favorite
deliberately designed
podcast.
To be jarring, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry about that if that upset you. I promise never to do it again. Spoiler alert for the matches we played of Anthony's regular cube on stream most recently that just went up on YouTube a week ago. Yeah, I felt like that deck, my red-green deck, could not lose. It was very, very, very good. Partially on the back of a couple new cards you just added to the cube. You just added Fires of Yavimaya, and you just added Bloodbraid Elf, correct?
Yeah, I literally was just going through the box of cards. I had a revelation, maybe not a revelation, that's too extreme. An idea about why maybe
look at all that water spill everywhere on my cube.
Why green was a little bit generally regarded as one of the worst or the worst color in the cube as far as just power level. Not in a way that's totally problematic.
I would temper that
a
little bit. I don't know if it's the worst. I think it's the least appealing. I think everyone
sure,
agrees if it's open, you're going to get a really good green deck and stomp people.
I don't know if everyone agrees with that.
I think most people agree that, but I would definitely contend that it is not the most fought after color in basically any draft.
And I was looking through the list and specifically at the gold column, and I don't necessarily try and balance, exactly 3 cards or whatever in each gold pair for a lot of reasons. But looking at it again, just after not thinking about it for a while, I realized the green color pair specifically didn't have, like you're saying, anything super appealing in them. There's no Baleful Strix type power level card to really pull you into any of the green color pairs. Maybe green-white a little bit, because I love that color pair.
Just Captured by Lagax is the good green-white card.
Okay, well, there's a lot of other cards there that I like.
Yeah, they're not power level outliers, though.
So I literally just went through, my collection, my box of gold cards, and tried to find things that would be a little bit more appealing, especially in green-blue and green-red, and I think it drew you in, so tentatively, first data point is success.
It did draw me in. We did a full draft of the cube, a full 8-person pod online, and then played the cubes in paper, which is what we've been doing generally on the stream, and I think it works out pretty nicely. The only downside is that people can't follow the draft. Maybe we'll have a solution for that in the future, though. And I saw Fires of Yavimaya in a pack, and I was like, I want to wheel that, and I think I will, because there were some other good cards that were less committal in the pack, and I was like, this is less likely to wheel because it's just a good red card. I took Lightning Strike or something, and then hope to wheel the Fires, and I did, and I felt like I was kind of all in. And green was just completely open at that particular table. I mean, I was wheeling Sylvan Advocates, which I think we all agree is one of the most potent green 2-drops in your cube, and I gotta say, I think that draft especially shows off the power of Bloodbraid Elf, because it did a lot of stuff in the matches we played with it, and it also really shows off the power of the hybrid Burning Tree Emissary, which is a card that I think people underrate. I multiple times in your regular cube, which is again a Masters level set power level, I was just like, turn 2, Burning Tree Emissary into Yavimaya Iconoclast. Enjoy 5 power on turn 2.
Mm-hmm.
You have 1 land in play.
I see people play it occasionally, but I have never really seen a deck that optimized it the way that your deck did. And I think it really was not just having things like Bloodbraid Elf and Fires of Yavimaya that are signposts for draft this color pair, but really try and draft something that's aggressive and going to put a lot of power on the board quickly. So yeah, I would say that kind of is making more of those cards make more sense.
The other thing that we've talked about in person, but not on the show, I don't think before, about green in that cube is that your green section is a bigger divergence from what green tends to be in most cubes than any of your other colors.
It's not really a ramp color at all, which in so many cubes is really a big part of the identity. And I think that, maybe another challenge with green is it doesn't have as strong an identity as the other colors, because it isn't leaning on the identity that it has in a lot of other contexts.
Well, I think people don't know what to do with Sylvan Advocates and Saddled Rhyme Stags, and the answer is play a sort of aggro deck, but I called it a mid-range deck, and I maintain that it is. It was mostly 2 and 3 drops, not mostly 1 and 2 drops, and had a lot of beef to carry through the mid game. I think people just don't, myself included a lot of times, just don't really know what to do with some of those cards, but that's the right shell for them, I think. I think that's the kind of red-green deck that can be very successful. Do you think either Bloodbraid Elf or Fires of Yavimaya are potentially power outliers?
A little bit, but again, we've talked about how gold cards generally should be somewhat power outliers. You are paying an extra cost. It is the kinds of cards that's going to draw people into a color pair, or you probably want them to be. So I think a little bit they are definitely high in terms of power level if we ignore the color cost. But I don't think in a problematic way. But we'll see after a couple more drafts.
Yeah, I don't think Fires is a power outlier. I think that card's really cool, and it's just the right amount of power level to pull me in, but not so much that it's Fires of Yavimaya, can't beat that. I guess I just scoop. It's not a dominating card. We did experience this thing, which I have not really experienced with that card before. I've mostly played it in my battle box, I should say. It's the place I've played that card the most by far. And I think that card it's subtle how good it is against a lot of kinds of removal. You have a lot of damage and other toughness-based removal in your cube, and it was just that's like having a Benevolent Bodyguard in play that gives all of your creatures haste and also is an onboard trick for +2/+2, which means that blocks become near impossible. It's a very mechanically simple card that makes everything a little bit of a headache for your opponent, especially if they're on any kind of toughness-based removal.
Yeah, totally. And there is a lot of that for reasons that we've discussed on previous episodes about how small removal just lets different kinds of cards function better, I think.
Yeah, like both you and Patrick at different moments in our matches had to basically like run into it and say like, yeah, I have to get rid of that fire somehow. So I guess I'll try and move this thing. You'll sacrifice the fires. We'll do the thing and then carry on with the gameplay.
Which, honestly, I kind of like that counterplay
Absolutely,
as well. I don't think it's necessarily a bad decision to say like, I can expect my opponent to sacrifice fires to trade for this removal spell, but if that's still a 1-for-1 trade, you still have a lot of space for players to make decisions that feel meaningful there.
The scary thing is
often
if
you're
they
going to be two for one-ing yourself, but you do what you can.
Yeah, I think people are generally more averse to those play patterns than they should be. I think it's oftentimes correct to be like, yep, I know you're going to do that thing, and I know it's what the card is supposed to do, but if you just live in fear of it, then I have more turns where I have haste, and more turns where my attacks are all good because you can't possibly block. You just got to get it off the battlefield at some point.
Yeah, and it is, to your point, really spooky when you give your opponent a choice, but you think that there is one obvious choice. Like, you're kind of walking them into doing something, and then they do the other thing.
That's what you don't want them to do. That's when you should be scared. Or maybe, your opponent's a big idiot, and you're fine. You don't have to worry about it.
But they're happy to lose their creature because they know they have a huge threat that they really want the haste for next turn.
Right,
or
next turn they're going to play deranged hermit or whatever and just have 10 power in play and swing
not in this context, but yeah, sure.
Didn't you have the other one in there for a while?
I don't think so.
Did you have Felonite Hermit in there for a while? The
Felonite Hermit is in
one.
the irregular cube.
Maybe I'm getting my cube wires crossed. It's possible.
It's very clear. Lots of cubes that have strong identities that are easy to keep straight.
I think it's more likely of the two that Bloodbraid Elf is maybe a problematic power outlier. It has this variance baked in, which means that it's kind of hard to evaluate how much of a power outlier it is, but I think if I can recount all of my hits in our matches, it was 1 Domri's Ambush, 1 Grumgully, which was gross, and 1 Pelt Collector, which was also pretty gross. That's just a lot of value for 4 mana in your cube, and the 3/2 body matters, like it's getting into combat often. So that's the card, if any, I think, to keep an eye out for, and I have such a love-hate relationship with that card. I hate the RNG. I hate Bloodbraid Elfing into a Mana Dork. That just feels awful, because it's almost always a point in the game where a Mana Dork does next to nothing. But also, I love so many aspects of that card. Like, I think it's very cool to have an aggressive card like that with haste that can attack, that gives you additional value. I love the additional value can't be answered by a counterspell, right? Because it's a cascade trigger, so even if they counter your Bloodbraid Elf, you still get something out of it. It's like, it's almost in the same, like, Isika's Chariot realm of, like, it has value in many different ways, and no one way can answer all of the value, but you can get rid of a lot of the value by answering one of the things. But then, you just flip into Elvish Mystic, and I'm like, this card sucks. I hate it.
Right, which I think makes this a cool context for it, because I'm really trying to push, like, yeah, if you're in green-red, just you're not doing a big ramp thing. You're not trying to cast a Tarka. You're trying to just cast big mid-range stuff and pressure your opponent.
It's a really good signal for that, I think, for sure.
And there aren't a bunch of dorks, so yeah, there kind of isn't it's not as easy to fall into a position where it's going to fail in that way. So I want to talk about just the kind of common pitfalls that people fall into when they're building their first cube. I see so many posts, especially on the Magic subreddit, or specifically the Cube subreddit, that are just not providing a lot of context or specific questions, but they're just asking, I just built my first cube, what do you all think? And I feel
Which is a completely fair and reasonable question. Of
Absolutely.
course, that's what everyone that builds their first cube wants everyone to do. Well, first is play it. Then if they can't play it, they want to know what they think about it.
Totally. And I think there's just a lot of common patterns, and we, as always, want to say that there isn't a right way to build a cube. There isn't some, like, objective truth, but it just comes up really consistently that there are half a dozen or so things that end up being mentioned almost every single time. I think that this question
every
gets
single
asked.
time, yeah.
So I think that, if you're in the position where you just built your first cube and you're looking for advice on it without any specific, questions or specific context that you're looking for, this is probably going to be the answer to what feedback you would get on your cube.
Yeah, it is. And I'll obviously echo your sentiment that there is no right or wrong way to build a cube, and this feedback might not apply to you, but I think that we can say that there are a lot of decisions that cube players make that are not serving their goals. And if it's not serving your goal, then it is the wrong way to build your cube, because it's not meeting your design goals. And a lot of these mistakes that at least I see cube designers make often are mistakes that are steering players away from their stated gameplay goals or their stated intentions with the cube. And so that's a context where I'm much more comfortable saying, like, yes, this is a common pitfall, because I see people falling in this pit instead of leaping over it and crossing the finish line of their desired gameplay.
To put this a different way, I think if your response to any of these points is, for a specific reason you disagree, you want to do it a different way, if you have a
Then
reason for
fight
it,
me. Send us an email.
no, then you're doing great. Then you have a reason. If your reason is, well, I don't know, I haven't really thought about it, then yeah, probably you should follow this advice.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. Pretty good heuristic. Should I play the role of somebody with a new cube?
Sure, go for it. You just build a new cube.
All right, I got my first cube here. So the archetypes are blue, white, blink, and black, blue ninjas, and red, black aristocrats, and
I love it.
blue, green counters, and red, white aggro, just aggro, and red, green stompy. They always just say red, green stompy.
What are you doing with blue, green?
I said counters.
Okay, great.
Which
kind of counters?
I mean the +1/+1 counters basically
okay, great,
on creatures.
Great. So actually, here's my first question: is how many lands are you running over here?
I think most cube designers run too few lands. I wrote a lot about this and have spent a lot of time thinking about this topic. I think a lot of cube designers just follow what they believe to be precedent set by existing cubes. You're familiar with the Magic Online cube, or maybe someone else in your playgroup has a cube. And for a long time, it felt like the presumed default was 4 cycles at 360, maybe 5 or 6 at 540 or whatever, was kind of where everyone landed. And I think if we trace all of that back, I can't prove this, but my theory is that this comes back in the early days of cube, people just not having enough quote unquote good fixing land cycles to put in their cube, right? Their cube was just the most powerful cards. And after they put in
the original duels,
Tundra,
lands,
the Fetch lands, Hallowed Fountain, and maybe the Pain lands, they were like, there's no more good lands left.
Right.
So there's my 4 cycles. That's why we have 4 cycles of lands in every cube. Obviously, now we have way more options. We also are big advocates for breaking singletons, specifically on mana fixing if you want to, but that's another topic. And I think most players end up squandering space by having too few lands in their cube.
So I would actually go even further in terms of what I see a lot of cube designers do, especially as I think the space is opening up a lot and people are more willing to not just make the most powerful cards cube. I see a lot of people doing things that are more thematic or based on sets. And what I see again and again is people put in a single cycle of 10 dual lands, whether that's, even just guild gates or whatever they have around what fits their theme. And I think that's our general advice is you can play definitely more than 4 cycles and absolutely more than a cycle of fixing lands.
The other important precedent I think to remember here is that if you're comparing your cube to retail limited, retail limited packs are very rarely going to have more than a single land in them because, frankly, a lot of players don't like opening lands in their packs. Lands aren't exciting. If you bought a pack at the mall because you're 8 years old and it's cool to have a pack of Magic cards, you don't want to open 5 lands. That feels like you got ripped off. So those motivations are a lot different than motivations for a cube.
Right. So I would say if we are going to be concrete, we would probably recommend anywhere between 10 to 15, maybe upwards of 20% of the cards in your cube be mana fixing lands.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
The number I recommended, I wrote this enormous article, 6,000 word article, and then the TLDR is put 60 lands in your 360 cube, but that's basically where I'm landing on it. So that percentage roughly is what I would recommend. If you don't have the desire to read my article, you don't have any desire to think about it any harder, I would say 6 cycles at 360.
I want to give some context to this, though, and look really quickly just at limited versus constructed and think about why this kind of makes sense, because it is a little bit weird that limited is one of our favorite ways to play Magic. It's a great way to play, but it is essentially just devoid of mana fixing lands at all, or any mana fixing.
In most sets, yeah.
In most sets, maybe you'll have an occasional dual land. Sometimes you'll get a dual land per pack, so you're essentially opening up. We could do some math, but we'll leave that.
This math was done in the article already. I believe
Excellent.
If there is a dual land per pack, you are maybe likely to get 2 of your specific dual land if you take them highly enough.
Right.
Still not that likely that you're going to actually get anywhere near a good mana base.
And the thing is that limited is fun. It's not like lands are essential
Hot take.
essential to making a cube draft work. There's going to be more variance. It's going to be a little bit more challenging to build a mana base that maybe you're comfortable with, or it's just going to be a different skill set, a different puzzle to solve of how are you balancing the risk of splashing for colors when you're just putting basics in your deck.
This is one of the things that cube designers take advantage of all the time. Whatever design decisions you make, it's just a different problem for all of your players who try and solve in the same way. It's one of the reasons why it's so forgiving to design a cube relative to, say, designing a bunch of pre-constructed decks to play against each other, because people get to draft, they get to make their own decisions, and so everyone's going to be trying to solve this problem. So yeah, if you have no lands in your cube, it's going to be fine. You're still going to have fun.
Right. But on the other hand, if we look at the other end of the spectrum of ways to play Magic in constructed, where people have full control to put essentially as many dual lands as they want, people play a lot of dual lands, which you broke down the specifics in your article for different formats. But I think that is telling that, if players have the option to play a lot of dual lands, even if they're just playing 2-color decks, they will play them. And so I think that just having that flexibility to say, if this makes sense, if this leads to the kind of decks that people will find feel better, feel more optimal, have a different kind of puzzle to solve that feels better, we can create that because we don't have all these other constraints that we would have designing an actual limited set.
I think a slightly more nuanced and complex way to describe this point is that I think a lot of cube designers, for their first pass of their cube, have a lot of squandered space that is basically just less appealing versions of other cards they already have in their cube. I know when I made my first cube, I would do drafts and be like, well, okay, I've got, 30 playables. What are my 7 cuts to get down to 23? And the 7 cuts were just like, okay, well, here's another burn spell, but it's just a slightly worse burn spell. Here's another green threat, but it's just the worst of my green threats or whatever. And when you do that, you end up having a bunch of cube space that is kind of just not doing anything. It's not realizing any of your design goals because people just aren't playing that worst chunk of your cube. Whatever percent it is, it's just mostly going to end up in sideboards. And instead, I would advocate that you could use that space to better serve your goals. And one of the easiest ways we can recommend doing that is just adding more fixing, because that will make pretty much every strategy in every deck work a little better, a little more consistently. So that's a good recommendation in a vacuum. You could also really want to prioritize a bunch of narrow build-arounds in your cube. So when your players have cards that are on color in their sideboard, they're not just worse versions of better cards in that same color. They're build-arounds that maybe in a different world could be a very high pick in their deck. Could be a really important card for their deck, but just didn't happen to come together this draft. You could fill it with a bunch of dedicated sideboard cards. There's a lot of other ways to take advantage of this space, and that's more nuanced and maybe hard to pack into a nice little tip, but that I think is the root of what's actually happening here.
For sure. It's always an option. Well, if you're starting with 0 fixing, there's a lot of space to make cards work in people's decks by replacing basics.
Yeah.
So the next big piece of advice that I end up giving and see other people giving is lower the mana curve. I see a lot of people that are designing their first cube. They reasonably are excited about the big 6-7 mana spells. Those are the exciting splashy things that maybe you are looking forward to casting in your games. But those aren't the spells that you're going to end up casting most of your games. The things that end up shaping the way that a lot of the games play, the things that are going to come up more often because you will have your first couple lands all the time, but your 7th land not as often, is just the cheaper spells. So I think that this is a really easy trap to fall into of just playing too much big expensive stuff, and it's worth taking the time to try and slim that down and tilt the curve down towards the cheaper end of the spectrum.
Yep, I agree completely. And here we can look at Retail Limited again for 2 points. One is just that, again, I think Retail Limited, they want big cards, big creatures in the packs. Big creatures are fun and exciting. They want them to be included in the packs. People opening up can see a couple big creatures. That might not be the best thing for a draft environment, but it's good for other reasons for selling booster packs. The other thing we can look at is how common the advice in retail draft is to prioritize 2-drops.
Absolutely.
Because the distribution of threats in the packs, the mana curves of the packs on average, is higher than people's resulting decks should be, which is why they're prioritizing the 2-drops. If the packs were 95% 2-drops and there were only a few 4 or 5 drops, the advice would be prioritize the 4 and 5 drops because there aren't that many of them and you want to have a couple in your deck. So the array of priorities that goes into what the mana curve of an average pack is at odds with the deck builder's priorities of just trying to have a lower curve. So I think pretty much regardless of what your goals are, that is good advice across the board.
Yeah, I think another good heuristic that you can use to try and evaluate what is a reasonable curve for your goals is think about what the kind of decks that you're used to drafting or, playing in constructed or you want to draft from this cube look like, and just try and mimic that in the whole environment. So if you expect decks to have, some number of 2 and 3 drops, maybe a couple 4 drops, and maybe 1 5+ drop, then just make the cube reflect that so you just don't have a whole bunch of huge creatures that aren't necessarily going to make it into your decks in the same percentage that they appear in the cube itself.
And if you're going to lean one direction from that baseline, definitely lean lower, right? Because it's not a problem to have too many cheap cards, right? You just have more decisions of what cards you're going to play in your main deck. Having too many expensive cards means that you're lacking in things to do early. And so if you're going to have too much of something, I think cheaper is always better.
Agreed.
I know one of my revelations too was just that there are so many 6 and 7 drops that essentially just say, win the game. And that's not actually that fun at the end of the day. If the mechanics of the card don't actually really matter because it just wins the game in some way very directly, in a turn or two, then you don't really get to play with the card that much. You cast it, your opponent scoops, and you're like, I didn't get to play with this card. I just got to put it on the stack, and then my opponent conceded. Whereas if your 2 and 3 drops are the really fun cards, like those are going to be in play for many turns. They're going to get cast in almost every game. It's just going to shape the way that your games play out.
I don't know if I can totally agree with that. There's all kinds of fun ways to win the game. You can put your Avenger of Zendikar on the stack, and your opponent says, "Oh, I think I'll scoop," and be like, "Wait, just give me a second to crack these 2 fetches."
There's a lot of that. Yeah, I mean, the story of my own cube is that I used to have a much higher curve, and then I was like, I actually think I can probably get away with mostly like 4 and 5 drops winning the game instead of 6 and higher. Then I was like, maybe I can actually get away with like 3 and 4 drops winning the game. And now I'm looking at like tons of decks, even control decks, leaning on 2 drops to win the game. That's like where my current cube focus is.
Yeah, and there's a lot that goes into that, but I think that to say it simply, I think another thing that just sort of backs up both of these pieces of advice is that's just how we see most cube designers go. They start out with their first design, which has maybe not that many lands and a high curve, and the trend that we see almost everyone go through after a few iterations after getting some playtesting is to add more lands and cut down on the curve.
Yeah, I mean, the second pod we had last night for our cube draft night, somebody had brought a copy of Sully Singleton's starter cube, and I saw one deck of our friends who came up and handed me his deck and said, check out my deck, I'm not doing that well. And I looked through his deck, and it was just all 4 and 5 drops. Like, that was just the whole deck, basically. It was like 4 and 5 drops plus Fibblethip, Thraben Inspector, and a couple mana rocks. And it's like,
I mean, that does sound kind of fun.
Sure, if you curve exactly Thraben Inspector into Mana Rock, into Fibblethip, into one of your 4 drops, great. That's cool, but that's so rarely going to happen. I think it's just a very common mistake, regardless of what your goals are, because the 4 and 5 and 6 drops do more. They are generally cooler cards because you have to pay more mana to get that effect. So it's very easy to look at a splashy 5 drop and a 2 drop and be like, well, of course I want more of this fun splashy 5 drop in my cube, but the reality is that the impact on gameplay is maybe not what people are expecting.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, that even if there are enough cheap spells to make decks that have reasonable curves, when you give players the opportunity to play just 4 and 5 mana spells, some players will just do that. So by skewing the curve even more towards those cheaper spells, I think you're kind of forcing players to draft decks that are going to be able to play reasonable games more often, which can actually be sort of doing them a service.
Yeah, I agree.
So the next point, I'm not sure, I'm less confident in this point, but I think another thing that does come up often is add more interaction. I think it is often easy for players to focus on the proactive aspects and, the bombs and the things that are going to make an individual deck work, and it's easy to forget a little bit some of the less exciting, just removal and things like that are going to actually keep the games interactive and feel fun and meaningful.
Yeah, I don't know if that is as common as the other two, certainly, but I definitely see that come up somewhat often. I think it's because a lot of players don't like playing against interaction. It's not fun to have your threat removed or your threat countered or whatever, and so you're like, well, I don't want that card to be cast against me, so I won't put cards like that in my cube. But that decision doesn't acknowledge the type of gameplay that's going to result from an environment where removal is at such a premium, which is, I mean, frankly, I think almost all of the factors we're talking about and more that are on this list are going to contribute to a specific kind of cube where it's just correct to play really greedy decks with greedy mana base and like 4 and 5 drops in multiple colors, and a thing that a lot of cube designers abhor, this like 4 and 5 color good stuff deck. I think almost all the pitfalls we're talking about are going to result in people heading that direction, and this is one of the ways that can happen, is if you don't have enough removal, then people are just going to be trying to go bigger than everybody else because that's the way to win.
Yeah, so I think that these honestly all really fit together, and it does sort of lead to that kind of snowballing effect of I'm just going to play the bombs in lots of colors because the cards are all expensive, so nobody's really going to be putting pressure on me, and there's not that much interaction, so I can get away with it. But if you're not looking for that kind of gameplay, again, this all goes back to just what you're looking for. If you want some more streamlined, focused, efficient decks that are maybe focused in fewer colors, focused on making the individual cards really shine, not just kind of a soup, then I think
even people that do want their cube to have mostly 3-color decks, and I've definitely played cubes where the idea is that most of the decks are 3 colors. That's kind of the baseline. Those designers don't want their players to still have like no draft decisions other than card evaluation.
Totally,
just take the best card in every pack. They still want them to be making some evaluation and deck building strategy based on whatever their specific goals are. So even if you do want more many colored decks, that doesn't necessarily mean you want people playing this like quote-unquote good stuff deck, where you just took whatever card looked the most powerful and jammed it in your deck.
Right. I think we could also look at limited a little bit for this. This maybe has changed a little bit in the last couple years, but historically, just taking the removal has always been a really big thing to prioritize in limited. So if you're designing your own environment, it kind of makes sense to just extend that to if people want more removal, if it makes decks play better, then you can just give it to people.
Yeah, I would temper that. I think that is not a great thing to optimize for, per se, if you were to just follow that to its logical conclusion and give everybody more of what they want for their specific deck in every pack.
Because it's all about things being relative.
Yeah, but I think that's a good point to be aware of, is that the things that are valued most highly in retail limited, why not simply give people more of those things and give them less of the things that everyone agrees are interchangeable, like 4-drops, you know?
Exactly, yeah. The next thing that I see people do a ton of is play a lot of gold cards.
This is a big one, I think.
I know we just talked about me putting more gold cards into my already pretty gold-heavy cube at the beginning of the episode, but that has been through a lot of playtesting and sort of focusing on particular goals. And you know, I think what we see with a lot of new cube designs is there's a ton of gold cards and they end up just going late in the pack, and it just takes away a lot of agency when the last 3-4 cards in your pack aren't cards that you can actually meaningfully play. You're taking up some space where people could be making interesting draft decisions.
Yeah, I think there's two problems with the preponderance of gold cards. One is that I think people just don't appreciate how narrow they are. You look at a gold card and you're like, well, sure, this is a good card. It's a good 3 or 4 drop or whatever. I'll put it in my cube. And every single gold card, in my mind, is some percentage less likely to get played in every draft than every monocolored card, just by the way the packs happen to break down, right? Even if it is a appealing red-green card, for example, because we're talking about red-green at the beginning of this episode, if you open a pack that's got a really good red card and a really good green card and this red-green gold card, then it might be entirely likely that you just don't get a pick to take that red-green gold card and you're the red-green drafter. Multiply that by the fact that in an average 8-person pod, if you're assuming 2 color decks as a baseline, then 2 whole guilds aren't even going to be drafted at all. So throw all those gold cards right in the bin. Those are quote-unquote wasted slots. There ends up being a lot of just people not appreciating how narrow they are. I think the bigger problem, though, is that this, like everything else, really contributes to the greedy 4 and 5 color pile decks, because you just reference all those players that get those late picks they can't do anything with because there's just that black-white card left in the pack because the black-white drafter took a white card instead, and now you're going to get it second to last pick. That really rewards players that just prioritize fixing early over almost anything else and then play whatever cards they get handed, because pound for pound, the gold cards are still going to be pretty good. I mean, gold cards are harder to cast. They should be a little more powerful for their mana value relative to everything else in the cube. And that's, I think, a bigger contributor to the success of a good stuff deck than, for example, density of mana fixing, even though I think the popular perception is that, a lot of mana fixing leads to a lot of many-colored decks. I would argue it's actually more this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And all 4 of these concepts, they really do, they work along the same sort of axis and contribute to the core gameplay and texture of games in different ways. And like you're saying, if someone is able to sort of just strategize around, there's not, the fastest deck at the table is not going to be that fast, I can afford to just take fixing and take the powerful gold cards, is definitely the way that a lot of new cubes can end up.
And if you think it's a factor of fixing, I would just propose that you think about retail sealed, right? Retail sealed, it's almost always correct, I think, to play at least a splash 3rd color, and you almost never have mana fixing. But in that environment, your power outliers are much better than your worst cards. There's a big delta in your power outliers, and so you get a lot of value by playing more powerful cards. And so if in your own cube, players are going to get a lot of value by having more cards they can possibly play from their pool, then they'll play an even shaky 3 or 4 color mana base to do it, and it might be correct on win percentage.
Yeah, definitely. So I think those are, to me, the 4 big things that I see most often, and the 4 pieces of advice that I give most often is play more lands, lower the mana curve, add more interaction, and cut out a lot of these gold cards.
Yep, I agree. I think the first 2 are the most obvious. Those 2 are in maybe a tier of their own, where I can't remember the last time I saw a cube where someone asked for advice and my immediate thought wasn't, you need more lands, you need to lower the curve. Those 2 things are basically a given all the time. The other 2 may be a little less common, but are still pretty common pitfalls I see. And like we said, I think this is all part of one story, right? And I think the story that this is part of is people often build their first cube with a focus on cards rather than a focus on decks. They want to include a bunch of cool and powerful cards, and they think that will result in cool and powerful decks, and it does, right? None of this is meant to imply that people's first versions of cubes are bad or not fun, right? It's still great. Cube is still fun. Draft is still great. It's just that you will end up serving your goals better if you start thinking about your cube in terms of decks rather than cards. And what that means is a deck wants more mana fixing, even if the lands aren't exciting to you and don't feel powerful in a pack. The deck wants even enter the battlefield tap mana fixing over basic lands or over sideboard cards they're never going to side in, right? The deck wants that more. The deck wants cheap cards it can play early in the game, even if your Serum Visions is not as exciting as your big Sphinx. That's the card that the deck is going to want more. And thinking in terms of not, well, I'm not going to cut my cool, powerful Sphinx for this dinky little cantrip, but instead of thinking, well, my deck is going to want a bunch of cheap spells to get stuff going early and to find the cards it needs, and only a couple finishers, so I really only need a couple of those in the cube. So yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think that that's the story this kind of tells overall.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful piece of context, because the 6-drop Sphinx that's got 3 colors, like, that is exciting. That is, to many of us, the fun part of the game. But if you're building an environment where it's easy for players to either just get stuck with that one card in their hand that they can't cast, they don't have an early way to stay in the game and keep their interaction going, then that's not going to be a fun, even though you get to sit there and read the flavor text while you're getting...
Hope it's got good art, because you're looking at it for a while.
Exactly. So really thinking about how are you going to build a cohesive deck that lets you optimize the cards that are those fun, splashy, big things. Or, you know, whatever aspect is the fun part for you, it has a context in the kinds of decks where it's going to make sense.
Right, whatever you care about in your cube, whether you care about specific synergies or tribal decks, or you really want to push monocolored decks, or whatever you want to do, I think every single one of these points still applies to those goals, because these points tend to kind of push a cube to a like mushy, muddy area where a lot of the actual goals get lost in players just taking good cards and putting them in their deck regardless of intended synergies or build-arounds or whatever.
Right, which touches on so I have 2 other things that are a little bit harder to pin down and identify, and I think take a lot more experience and context to really nail down. The first of which is that I see a lot of new cubes are focused on particular synergies, but those synergies are often sort of overshadowed just by individual cards that are big power outliers.
Yeah.
I think a great example of this is Sam Black mentioned in his video post-CubeCon, talking about Fable the Mirror Breaker, and how in a lot of cubes people put it in as this like great synergistic glue card because it was an enchantment and it cared about entering the battlefield and about,
and it made artifacts.
Exactly.
And it was a discard outlet and all these things.
But at the end of the day, that card is just extremely powerful. So if you're trying to put it into an environment that is focusing on, making the fun thing be about combining these cards that have these synergies and making your cards worth more than the sum of their parts, that just isn't going to happen when an experienced player just sees that card and says, I'm going to take that and I'm going to win just with that, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, I don't know if it's recency bias, but I have seen, there's been a trend on Twitter of Magic streamers and pros in this last go-around of the Winter Cube rating what they believe to be the top 50 cards of the cube in order, just like on power level, which is a fraught exercise, but interesting nonetheless. So many people had Fable the Mirror Breaker in like the top 20, the top 15, the top 12 cards in the entire cube. I was very surprised to see people rate it that highly. I mean, I think the card's really good, but I would not have expected people to rate it as high as people did.
Yeah, I mean, cards are extremely powerful. I don't know how to make this into more concrete advice other than just looking at the cards that you want to be exciting build-arounds and thinking about the ceiling, how powerful they can be when you really maximize them, the floor of how bad they are when you don't maximize them, and then think about the floor and ceiling of other just powerful cards in the environment, and think if that synergy, if the payoff for hitting that ceiling is actually worth it over taking something that's just going to be powerful on its own.
Honestly, this might just be as simple as like a lot of new cubes just have bigger power outliers than their designers would actually say they want. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it is that people oftentimes get drawn to cube because they want to play a specific card or a specific set of cards they don't get to play somewhere else. Yeah. So many people have Sol Ring in their first version of their cube. I see that a lot these days because Sol Ring is a staple of Commander.
It feels natural. It feels normal to play with Sol Ring.
Well, I mean, it's such a weird card because it's a staple of Commander in the sense that WotC has established that they're going to print it all the time in every Commander product, basically. There's a million printings of it. It's like so integral to the identity of the format in my mind, but also if you made me in charge of the Commander ban list, well, if you made me in charge of the Commander ban list, I would take pretty much everything off of it. But if you said I had to ban some stuff, this would be one of the first things I would ban. It literally goes in every single deck.
If you're banning the Power 9.
A huge power outlier, it goes in every single deck. It's just, it doesn't really make sense. And putting that in a cube environment, you'll feel it a lot more than you feel it in a Commander game. You could be building a multiplayer cube, but if you're building a cube that plays one-on-one matches, you will feel the huge disadvantage you are at when your opponent plays a Sol Ring and wonder why you put that in your cube. And the same goes for other cards, right? It does not matter what synergies your opponent has when they play a Sol Ring on turn 1, because the 4-drop from any of those synergistic decks on turn 2 is going to kick your teeth in.
Yeah, and I mean, we could substitute synergy with whatever it is you find fun about the cube. Like, we've said before, you want to make the thing that is actually the fun, the thing that you enjoy, the thing that is powerful and is winning, so when your players sit down and try to win, they will be doing the thing that you think is fun, and hopefully they think is fun as well.
And honestly, the first version of my cube, what I thought was fun was specific cards. I was like, I want to play with upheaval. I want that to be fun.
Oh, that wasn't fun.
I want
me.
opposition to be fun.
Also not fun. Keep going.
The point is, like, these were the reasons I built a cube, though. I wanted to play with wildfire or whatever. To me, that's what was fun. I put them in cube. They were power outliers. They were deciding games. And that's a big part of what my goals were. And you might be in that same spot, too. That's a perfectly valid thing to do, to want to play with these cards. I think most people that do that and get to play with it for a while will eventually, kind of get it out of their system and then move on to different kinds of gameplay they want to prioritize. But that is not in any way to denigrate that kind of cube, because it's really fun to get to do those things.
Right.
And not fun to have them done to you, but
no.
I recommended drafting them instead of letting your opponents draft them.
Great point. So the last thing I think I see a lot of people get stuck on is this idea that you have to fill out specific archetypes for every 2-color pair. And we've done a whole episode about this, but I think it's worth touching on here as well, that the sort of second question, or the follow-up to, here's my first cube, do you have any feedback, is often, I'm not sure what to do with this particular color pair. I have 9 of my archetypes defined, but this one I'm not so sure about. And my suggestion here would be just don't worry about it. If you're getting stuck on
something, down, do less.
Then it doesn't really matter, because honestly, you don't really need these archetypes as well at all. If you just have a defined sort of feel to each of the individual colors, then it's going to be an interesting combination however you mix them up. So, green has big creatures, black has removal. You combine that, that's going to have a certain sort of texture of gameplay that's going to be different from combining black with its powerful removal with blue with its other kinds of interaction. And it doesn't need to be, a specific card that one is for the black-green deck and one is for the black-blue deck. The powerful removal spell will make sense in a different way in both of those color pairs. So, I would just say don't get stuck on this. And again, if filling out the archetypes is the part that is fun for you, totally pursue that. But if you feel like you're getting stuck, or it has to be a certain way and it has to be complete and structured, it definitely doesn't.
Yeah, if you find yourself cutting cards that you otherwise really like because it doesn't match your intended structure, or not adding cards you love because it doesn't fit what you would think that archetype for that color pair is, then that's the point where it's becoming a detriment to your cube design and should be cast aside instead of adhered to. We do have an entire episode on this, but I think this today stems from the fact that now every set that Wizards makes generally has a signpost gold uncommon that kind of tells you what that color pair is about in that set. That's a very common thing we see from Wizards of the Coast. And you can listen to our whole episode about this if you want more information, but TLDR, I think that the reasons for that are, again, specific to the unique goals and priorities of making a standard set for Booster Draft. And a lot of those goals and priorities do not apply to most cubes. Yeah,
it is interesting how I was looking through this list and thinking basically all of these stem from the fact that people are trying to build cubes as if they are limited sets, which maybe seems ironic to say because I love limited.
And a cube is a limited set in some ways.
And I specifically build a lot of cubes that are trying to play like limited, but in a lot of these details, in the mana curve, in the sort of density of fixing, I think a lot of those things it doesn't necessarily make the most sense to take those exactly from the structure of limited sets.
If you have nothing else, I have one thing that I have noticed a lot of recently that I think we gotta talk about.
Token creep.
No, we are big proponents of people doing whatever they want within Magic. That's why we love Cube, right? You can do whatever you want. It's this like empty space you can play with. It really maximizes Magic as a game system as opposed to Magic as one singular game. And both you and I have designed cubes that modify the rules of Magic in some way. You've made the Turbo Cube, where spells and abilities cost 2 less to activate. I've made the Degenerate Micro Cube, which has different preconditions for the game, different deck size, and a modification to not losing from mill. So we've played in this space before, and I'm sure in the past on this podcast, we've encouraged people to also do that. Like, why not just make the cube that you're thinking of and change the way cards are evaluated and contextualized?
Yeah, I mean, you can't do those sorts of things at your Modern event or your draft at local F&M, but you can do them in cubes. So if you want to do
Magic's rules hold up to it. Like, Magic rules can support that. You can write it in a way that there's no ambiguity around what happens in a given situation, which is a huge accomplishment. I think new cube designers especially should take the idea of customizing rules very seriously and consider it like it's a huge cost to modify the rules. Not to discourage anybody that wants to explore this space from exploring it. By all means, you should explore it. Just acknowledge the fact that if you are modifying rules, every modified rule is one more barrier to any would-be drafter. It's one more thing they think they have to think about that makes them feel like, I don't know how to draft this cube. It's going to be too much. I can't handle it. It makes them like question whether or not they're even able to play the cube. It's one more thing that you potentially could have like gotten wrong. Maybe the rules modification you made actually kind of messes up the game in some way, and you didn't realize it until you played a bunch of games, and then everyone's experience was like the example I love to give here, this is a really detailed one, but in the Degenerate Microcube, you do not lose to drawing from an empty library, because libraries are really small. My idea for that was just that once you're not drawing a card every turn, that's already a huge cost, right? If your opponent's drawing cards and you're not, then that's a huge detriment. You'll probably lose that game eventually anyway, but let's just not make milling a win condition, basically. And this was great in all regards, except for in context of one card, and that card is Ensnaring Bridge. Because Ensnaring Bridge is a card that if your opponent doesn't have an answer to it, you can oftentimes just play it and force a draw, regardless of how badly you're losing that game, because nobody dies from drawing from empty library. I think the mill-out win condition in regular Magic makes that end case of Ensnaring Bridge a lot less common. So I was like, let me add one more little twist. I'm going to do it.
One more twist.
Just one more little tiny rules change, which is that if the game ends in a draw and you have Ensnaring Bridge in play, you lose. That was the rule I tried to implement.
One small twist. I think we should apply that to all of Magic. They should just codify that on the card.
That is what I introduced. My goal here with this rules modification was just to prevent people from siding in Ensnaring Bridge in a deck that didn't care about it at all to potentially cheese a tie out of their opponent, which then would mean they don't lose that particular game. And the first draft where I implemented this rule, I had a player that basically did have a deck where Ensnaring Bridge mattered, and their opponent, instead of trying to win the game, just sideboarded into trying explicitly to get a draw because they knew their opponent was likely to have Ensnaring Bridge in play, and they succeeded in doing so, and the Ensnaring Bridge player was really upset with me, and I was like, fair, that sucks.
That's actually amazing. That sounds a lot like the playtesting of Oko, where they're like, we didn't think people would do it to other people's stuff.
Yeah, so I thought that was like a relatively safe thing, and I immediately like undid that rules modification. I'm like, nope, we're just going to have to deal with there sometimes being draws from Ensnaring Bridge because that is not tenable, right? And as soon as I changed that rule even ever so slightly, it totally changed deck building and sideboarding motivations, and players were optimizing for a weird thing I didn't expect. So every time you change a rule, you are risking that, right? You're risking somebody optimizing for something you don't expect. We had a player in a local play group, Max, somebody that went to CubeCon with us, who explicitly didn't like the idea of having to discard to hand size if they are on the draw and played a Ravnica bounce land on turn 2. And so they were like, let's just get rid of the maximum hand size. Like, how much could that actually affect games? And I can tell you for sure, in the first couple of drafts of that cube, it really mattered. There were lots of us that had 11 cards in hand and didn't have to go to our discard step, and we're like, this is great. This is really broken. He eventually got rid of that rule too. So it's something I just want to hazard people against. Like, I think I can speak for both of us when I say that, like, we are still wholly in support of anybody doing anything they want with the game of Magic. If this is something you want to explore, you should explore it. I just think people should explore it with awareness of the costs.
Yeah, I would say that the cost for doing any sort of custom rules, card alterations, things like that is just a lot higher than you think at first, because people are used to playing Magic a certain way. When you modify the rules, there's no maximum hand size. That's really easy to explain. People can understand that, but they're going to forget it in match 2 when they're deep in a game and it hasn't come up until that time, so it just hasn't been in front of mind. And somebody's going to discard a card and then 2 turns later forget that they shouldn't have had to, and it's going to lead to a lot of complications and sort of difficult moments. And these things really add up. If you have multiple different rules changes, altered cards, things can really just trip people up. So it is fun. It's a great space to explore, but I think that my recommendation would definitely be start with the vast amount of space you can explore of just combining different combinations of cards into your first cube. And then once you sort of have some more confidence in the fact that you can put cards together into a cube that people can draft and have fun with, you'll be better equipped to understand how those rules modifications will actually play out and change things, both in terms of the gameplay and players' experience with the game.
And maybe another way to say it is just, unless your goal is explicitly exploring rules modifications, do not modify rules.
I think that's a great idea. Like, I love that, because I think a lot of these things are very well-meaning, saying, like, I want to fix this one card. And I did this a couple times early in my cube as well.
I remember your copy of Malicious Affliction with two generic mana added to it and the non-black Sharpied out. I remember this.
And there were another number of other cards that I just adjusted in small ways where I thought, well, this individual card is going to be a lot better for this environment, and there isn't really a card like it, so I think it's worth it. And it just was a little bit too confusing that it just felt not worth it. Like, how many times did a player need to get tripped up by forgetting that there was this rules change for it to be not worth it for me? Kind of once, and it happened like 4 times.
Also, just on the emotional side, it really feels bad to lose an interaction because of a rule that the cube designer has explicitly changed.
Yeah.
It's kind of like
it's hard to.
It's kind of like an inverse
overstate
trolley
that.
problem where it's like you pulled the lever, so now I'm mad at you because if you didn't pull the lever and the game of Magic just happened to be that I lost this rules interaction, then it's not your fault. It's it's the game more broadly. But no, you're the one that sharpied out the non-black on this malicious affliction, and now it's removing 2 of my black creatures, and I'm flipping you the bird.
I'm sorry about that.
So
yeah, I think
that didn't actually happen. I don't think, but that's an example of a thing that can potentially happen.
I think that's a great way to boil down this piece of advice is. Maybe don't. Our
if
advice
that's
would
not
be,
your cube's whole thing, is a particular modified rule, don't
Yes.
just modify a rule here or there. I think it's a bad idea.
I agree. Unless you want to.
You have such a hard time drawing a line in the sand.
Well, here's where I think that it does start to make sense is if you're playing with a dedicated group of people that are playing the same cube over and over, like with a regular schedule, then doing those kinds of like small hot fixes makes a lot more sense. But if you're going to especially be taking your cube to a new group where there's going to be 1 or 2 new players every week that are playing the cube for the first time, that is where those risks again really add up into having people have a weird experience so they get confused, get tripped up, and don't have a lot of fun with it.
I have definitely felt this the most when explaining a cube to somebody new, right? And especially those rules that almost never come up. Like, I felt so stupid the couple times I was like, and if you die to a draw,
if there's
a draw and an ensnaring bridge doesn't play, then actually
Did you at
lose.
least write on the ensnaring bridge?
I didn't. I should have.
You
just,
lose the game
put a little
if,
post-it note in it.
Definitely do that. Make it clear.
I think a similar thing is Max's, don't discard to hand size just because he didn't like the play pattern of not being able to play a bounce land on turn 2 without casting a spell. That comes up so infrequently that having to even explain it, like the cognitive load of having to say it at a table with 7 other people and have everyone think about what that potentially means and think about why'd you do that and think about how does that change card evaluations, that is a real speed bump to a draft.
Yeah, it really is.
I think it's a pretty tidy list of common pitfalls that I see cube designers making. Yeah, this comes from many years of you and I looking at the Cube subreddit and being on the Cube Discord and having someone new pop in and post their first Cube lists. And yeah, these things come up all the time. So if you're a new Cube designer, hopefully this is helpful for you. If you've had your Cube for a long time, maybe these things will still resonate with you in ways you could potentially make your Cube better serve your goals.
Yeah, so the next time you see somebody posting their Cube wherever and they say, ask me for...
Just post a link.
Just post a link to this podcast episode and say, here's the feedback. Unless you disagree with it, and then let us know as well. We're always curious how other people approach other people's new cubes.
All right, Anthony, we are closing out today on a Pack 1 Pick 1. This is the one we alluded to a couple episodes ago where we both agreed it was a really cool cube and we wanted to do this Pack 1 Pick 1. And this comes to us from listener Garrett. Garrett has a Frozen Solid cube, which is based in Ice Age block and then also explores Alliances and Cold Snap as other sort of complementary sets to Ice Age. So it's a very kind of old school cube. Ice Age, kind of a notoriously underpowered set in some ways. At least certain types of cards were. Had, Brainstorm in it, which was pretty good. But your average, creatures were not most powerful during the Ice Age era. And the cube is just really interesting. It has a lot of cool decisions about it. So
yeah, it's just cool that, like you said, this was kind of like a notoriously disliked set in a lot of ways, I think, for a lot of people, or at least this sort of period of Magic. So to see somebody having a different take on it and really leaning into the nostalgia and making an environment that reflects what they enjoy about the game.
I don't know that Ice Age was...
I might be muddling a little bit.
I think you're muddling it with Homelands and Fallen Empires a little bit.
Okay.
Because the cards look the same.
They do look the same.
It was the same printing era, but I think of those sets, Ice Age was definitely the most well-regarded compared to Homelands and Fallen Empires. All right, Anthony, I'm going to hit you with this pack. The pack is Counterspell, Karplusan Minotaur, Ronom Hulk, Volatile Fjord, Battle Frenzy, Witigo, Battle Cry, Frozen Solid, the card that presumably...
The eponymous
Frozen Solid, Jeweled Amulet, Vanish into Memory, Rime Transfusion, Into the North, Rime Feather Owl, Sibilant Spirit, and Exile. Sibilant Spirit. That could be the new Sibilance, the new mic check. A lot of cards to read in this pack, Anthony, at least for me.
There are a lot of cards. There's a lot of creatures with interesting downsides, which is always interesting to see.
Interesting.
We're used to reading a 6-mana creature, and it also has 3 upsides, and you get to choose from this menu. And here it's like, it's got cumulative upkeep 1. I don't have a good sense for how high a cost cumulative upkeep 1 is.
A lot.
It sounds like a lot. Or on the Witigo, that if it doesn't enter in actual attacks or blocks, it just shrinks over time. So I feel like your opponent can kind of get a sense of how much damage they're going to take from it and if it's worth attacking or blocking. At the same time, it's still a pretty big creature. So I'm looking at these big creatures, trying to get a sense for them, but I think that Counterspell is just really hard to pass up here. It's classic, I know what it does, and it's very powerful. Other things that stand out to me are Volatile Fjord. I expect fixing to be pretty relevant, and this is a snowland, which is going to be relevant to a lot of effects. And Jeweled Amulet is a card that I'm curious about, but I don't think I would take very highly, but it kind of does something a little bit broken in terms of letting you skip ahead in terms of mana.
Yeah, the cards I'm looking at are also Volatile Fjord, also Jeweled Amulet, and also I'm adding Into the North into the mix here.
Yeah.
Garrett is breaking Singleton here on snow non-basics, and so Into the North is basically going to be a Rampant Growth ++ almost certainly in your deck. And this is an environment where I think Ramp will probably be pretty relevant, given the nature of the threats, which is why I like both Jeweled Amulet and Into the North. Counterspell is obviously a good card. There's nothing wrong with it. I think it's pretty committal, and it's worth noting that Counterspell obviously scales with the environment, right? Like, Counterspell is in my Bun Magic cube,
right,
which is a very, very powerful cube where most cards in that cube, if in this pack, you would just snap up because it's a much more powerful environment than this is. But Counterspell isn't, like, objectively powerful in this, like, universal sense because it's always relative to the cube. So you're still going to have to be heavy blue deck, and you're just going to be countering their Rime Feather Owl or whatever, which is good still. You're going to do it, but the card just scales in a way that I don't know that... I think it might be a little bit of familiarity that pulls you to the counterspell here, I guess.
It's definitely possible. I mean, it's always going to be a one-for-one exchange, which I think is a big part of why it does scale to an appropriate way to different power levels. Unlike if you had, a 4-mana draw 3. That would be maybe not great in your environment, but would probably be really powerful here, where just the cost to effect is going to scale differently than counterspell, which is always its effect is going to be matched to what are the opponent's threats.
Yeah. I think Jeweled Amulet's the best card in this pack.
Really?
By a pretty big margin.
Well, then I feel better about pointing it out.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, Jeweled Amulet is a 0-mana artifact, and it has an activated ability, pay 1 and tap it to put a charge counter on it, and note the type of mana, blah, 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 blah. You basically put a charge counter on it, and whatever mana you paid to put that charge counter on it, you can, in the future, tap it to remove that charge counter and add that mana to your mana pool. So it's kind of like a Mox you have to charge up every other turn, right? You are never actually mana positive on Jeweled Amulet, but you can essentially move mana between turns.
Yeah, you just teleport 1 mana into the future,
which can be really powerful, right? I mean, this card, you can play it on turn 1, and if you have no other turn 1 play, you can put a mana into it, and then on turn 2, you just play a 3-drop, and you can do that in any deck. Doesn't matter what color you're playing. You don't have to be playing green to get this ramp ability. The fact that it's colorless here is why I'm going to take it so highly. It's also a really cheap card, obviously, at 0 mana, so it will definitely help my curve considerations no matter where it ends up. And I just don't know any of these other cards well enough to be convinced that anything here is a big power outlier.
You can charge it up to pay for those cumulative upkeeps down the road.
You can, it's true. I think the other cards that I'm curious about looking at this pack are like Vanish into Memory, I think could be very good here, maybe. I also don't know if a removal spell like Exile is going to be really powerful, given that I don't think threats in this era tended to be good against removal. There weren't really Mull Drifters in this era of Magic, to my knowledge. So if you get to exile their thing and gain a bunch of life in a sort of slow, long game where everyone's playing 6-drops, then maybe that's really potent. So I'm not really sure how to rate these other cards, but I feel confident that Jeweled Amulet is going to contribute to my strategy no matter what it is.
All right, I'm going to be a coward and I'm going to stick with Counterspell, but I'm ready to die getting beaten down by a Wittigo. Wittigo?
I think it's Wittigo, but I don't know why I think that. That's just what my brain thinks. I can be responsible for what my brain thinks.
Is that how that works?
Yeah, I can. It's true.
Okay, great.
And on that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you all for tuning in. I haven't mentioned it in a hot minute, but if you are enjoying the show, the best thing you can do is go on iTunes, give us a nice little 5-star review, and write a little comment. Just any kind of little positive comment. That does actually really help in certain places in terms of visibility for the show. We also have been putting all of our episodes on YouTube, so if you want to watch over there, you can. If you don't, you can even just go and like and subscribe, smash some bells over there, help us spread the word of what we're doing. Really, the best thing you can do is just tell a friend. Tell a friend about this podcast, that you enjoy it. Send them an episode you like, and try and spread the word that way.
Especially if you have a friend that just built a brand new cube, and you don't want to tell them again to add more fixing lands.
This is a great way. This is a great way to hint to your friend that maybe they shouldn't have that rule that Blue mana becomes green mana if it moves between phases. Whatever.
But it makes that one card just play so well.
Whatever rules modification they have. This is an intervention, friend. Insert your name here.
Okay, well, I have a new cube to design where at the end of every turn, you shift all of your mana into the next color.
I stopped listening. I checked out.
It's going to be really cool. I'm excited about it.
I'll tune in next week to hear what Anthony does with that. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I thinking really hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. I'm looking forward to MagicCon Philly, Anthony.
I'm really looking forward to it as well.
I don't consider myself a con guy, but CubeCon was so good that maybe I'm becoming a little bit of a con guy. I don't know.
Only one way to find out.
I guess go to some cons.